All right, and I have turned the recorder on. This is George Topalidis with the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, Black Faculty Recruitment and Retention Project at UF, Oral History Project at UF. I'm here with with Mr. Ryan Hope Travis. And I guess the first question I have, Mr. Travis, is where were you born and where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I was born in New Jersey and I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Culturally, I'm African American, but after having done my genealogy, I actually discovered that I'm 30% Nigerian, Kenyan, indigenous Amazonian, and French and German. And I say that because all of those cultures intersect into how I see myself. For example, I'm learning Shona right now, which is a language that's spoken in Zimbabwe. I'm deeply interested in also research and traveling on the African continent as well as abroad. So, culturally, I'm African American, but I understand that to be African American is actually a part of the larger African diasporic experience.
Can you share with me some experiences from your formative years that made you feel a sense of inclusiveness and belonging?
Yeah. So where I grew up, which is in Atlanta, everybody was Black, right? And that means my elementary school, my middle school, my high school, all the teachers, there were probably one or two white teachers, but the spaces, for good or bad, still maintain the segregation, that the remnants of segregation, right? So we grew up in an area that everybody were in apartments, so there wasn't any property taxes that were being pumped into the public school district that we were at. So the schools, we had hand-me-down books, and the computer lab had 2 computers for a school with 500 kids, but all the challenges that came along with, the lack of resources, the instructors made way. And so, I learned early on ingenuity and what it meant to create spaces despite formal support. And so for me, witnessing my teachers do it, and more specifically, like seeing my mom do it as a single parent, raising my sisters and I with $12 an hour, and we still had a rich life. So I understand rich as the real definition of wealth, not necessarily money, but like there's a complete richness in terms of how I came to be who I am. And so I bring that into my spaces as an artist, as a teacher, because really formative for me is the coming of age story, where I was able to witness the absence of resources, but the ingenuity that happened in response to that lack.
Did you experience any prejudice or discrimination or sort of microaggressions during your formative years in your neighborhood, grade school, or high school?
Yeah, so I mentioned, like, structurally, there was things that as middle schoolers and high schoolers that we just came to accept, like the fact that our books were always tattered and used, and we never knew why, but those books weren't the latest editions. For whatever reason, it was never explained. And it always seemed like the technology wasn't accessible. So I remember when I was in middle school, and actually as far back as elementary school, the media center had just gotten access to these CD-ROMs. And it was like a new way that students were going to be able to learn. They were going to integrate technology into the classroom space. And within the first or second week, it was back to the norm. So there were questions about access, and it always felt like we had to make do. And what I understand now is it was structural, right? And the teachers, some of them made a way, some of them were deeply passionate, and some of them were just counting down to retirement, right? Because the structure didn't support a teacher who may have been passionate but couldn't commit 80 hours to make this work, you know? So my adult self looking back on those experiences, specifically as a student, is really about the systemic racism that exists within the system itself. And I can think of personally, my sister, she moved down, my younger sister, she moved to Atlanta when she was 6. And I moved down when I was around 8 to 10 years old. And so I learned to read in New Jersey. But my little sister, she was supposed to learn how to read in Georgia. But because there were so many gaps in the system, to this day, she still struggles with reading and is embarrassed. And so how she's overcome, she's literally put herself on a regimen of phonics and relearning. So as she teaches her daughters, she wants to fill in the gaps that she had. And so in my own family, I was able to witness, here's what the system does in the absence of systemic support.
When would you say you were first aware of your race?
Ooh. Okay. So this is not the first time I was aware, but this comes to my mind. When I was in college, I was a freshman and I was selected by the university administrators to represent my school. I went to a historically Black college. And so even in college, it was Black faculty. So it was culturally Black spaces. And so the HBCU is and was a public university. And so the governor, who was Sonny Perdue, who served on Trump's cabinet, if it just kind of give you some context, he was a governor of Georgia at the time. And he had this week-long forum where all the public universities were to select 2 students to represent the college and then do a bunch of leadership workshops. And so when I was there, I was one of 2 Black people, and it was about 50 student leaders represented. And let me tell you, George, I mean, I was always aware, like, okay, I'm one of the only people of color, but there was like a gala, and the governor was there, and I was sitting at a table, and I saw somebody do this to me, like somebody in my vicinity was pointing at me. And I was like, okay, I don't know what this is about. So the governor walks behind me, pats me on the back, has me stand up, and out of nowhere, a photographer swoops in, gets a picture of me and him shaking hands. And George, I knew immediately this was the photo op. This was the picture to show us giving back to the impoverished or underrepresented. You know, and you're 18, 19 years old. I knew I was being used as a token. I wasn't oblivious to what was happening, even though in majority of my spaces, I was like one of many Black folk in the room. But in that instance where I was one of 2, race was clear. And, you know, as a side story, I am aware of my race and have been aware because perpetually I would be the safe person to talk about slavery with, right? Whether it was a substitute teacher, whether it was the dentist, whatever white person that I may have crossed paths with, I was the safe face to talk about well, slavery was a tough thing. And it just happened yesterday, George. Like I'm taking horseback riding lessons because I'm working on a film. My character has to ride a horse, and so as an actor, you want to be prepared for everything. So I'm taking these horseback riding lessons, and bless my teacher. She's a white lady, and the second time meeting her, we had a conversation about slavery, and it's like, how do we navigate those spaces? Perhaps that person wants to be in a safe environment to have an open discussion about race, but what does it mean for me to be met with that? So yeah, it continues.
What made you decide to attend college? Who encouraged you to do so?
Yeah, so college was not an expectation in my household, nor was it an expectation in the high school or the community where I came up in. Everybody was aware that there were viable opportunities to make a living and be successful, whether it was a trade, whether it was, going straight into the workforce. The expectation wasn't to jump into college. In fact, my older sister, she was the first person in my immediate family who went to college in generations, because it was just her friends were doing it, and it seemed like, okay, this could be a path. And for me, I wonder what made me ultimately choose to go to college. I guess for me, thinking back on it, I wasn't ready to commit to a job, right? I've always been somebody who looked for opportunities, whether it was a summer internship or whether it was an opportunity to travel abroad, find scholarships. I was doing this all through high school. I found a fellowship with the U.S. Olympics when I was a 10th grader, not because I was athletic, but because it was an opportunity to travel to Colorado for a leadership forum. And I was always finding ways and spaces to learn and expand. And college was just something that other people talked about. I didn't know what an Ivy League was. I didn't know what a community college was. It wasn't, I just knew it was university, right? And so my sister went to an HBCU, and I didn't know what an HBCU was. I just went to the same college she went to, you know? And I think when I got to my senior year, I made the decision, okay, I'm going to go to college. So let me scramble to figure out what FAFSA is. And my mom didn't know. We didn't know what student loans meant until my sister went through it. So it was a collection of seeing other people do it and having my sister go through it briefly. It was like, all right, this seems like a viable option. But where I grew up, it wasn't presented as the sole choice. It was like, you can go to work at Walmart, you can go to college. And it wasn't anything pressuring any direction. It was whatever you want to do, you know. So that's how I ended up in college as I reflect on it.
Which HBCU did you go to?
I went to a school called Fort Valley State University. It's in Middle Georgia. It's about, I think it's 80 miles south of Atlanta. So it's in Middle Georgia, small university, about 1,400 students. And it's a land grant university. So what that means is the University of Georgia uses the agricultural land that is on this sprawling campus to help train their students, in the same way that UF has it is a land grant institution. So was that HBCU, because it was situated around like hundreds of acres of land where students from other universities would learn how to other universities would learn how to till the land, work cattle and stuff like that.
Did you experience any prejudice or discrimination or microaggressions during your college years?
During my college years, give me 1 second. This is a student. Give me 2 seconds. I'll respond to her. In my college years, because it was an HBCU, you know, the opportunities mostly come in the terms of personal expansion and personal development, but not necessarily due to racism per se or structural prejudice. The experience going to the governor's mansion that happened when I was in college, so it was outside of the incubator of the HBCU. And then after Fort Valley State, I went to Syracuse University for my master's degree in Pan African Studies. And so there, it's a private school. Tuition was at the time in the upper $40,000 a year. And although it was a private school, you know, the department I was in, the African American Studies department, was a deeply culturally rooted space within the community. So that there again felt like a safe space, even though it was situated in a larger, traditionally white institution. And then from there, I went to the University of Florida, which was a different experience as a student altogether. Because there I was aware of my race and how few of us it was, and some of the experiences we had even in the classroom being a student of color.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. So I was a student over a decade ago at the University of Florida, and things have changed in a really positive way. I mean, I'm a faculty member in the School of Theater and Dance. At the time, I'll give you this as context. My MFA program, it was 13 of us that started. By the time we graduated, only 7 made it. It wasn't because the program was so rigorous, which it was, but it was the subversive racism. It was the perpetual feeling of being marginalized as a person of color. It was the experiences of being a student of color in an institution that made you feel invisible, right? And so where we are today as a university is different 10 years ago, right? So I can't imagine what it was 50 years ago. And so the work that's being done in response to the summer of 2020, the intention for this racial justice initiative, this work is recent, right? And so we find as an institution a deep commitment to be anti-racist, to acknowledge structural racism, but it's taken a while to get there, But as a student 10 years ago, it was difficult. It was difficult. It was difficult. And so,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, just to kind of give some context, I also responded to the Racial Justice Initiative, and I am doing a project that's funded by the university that is bringing back those Black alumni who at some point have felt subjugated. And the ensemble, we're creating a play with those alumni. So that play actually opens in November, and it's been an ongoing project. It's healing on all sides. The play happens to be about the Newberry Six, which is a lynching that happened in 1916. So that's the subject matter, but we're using alumni who at some point in their journey felt the things that I'm talking about now.
Do you recall any specific episodes or instances where you felt discriminated against or felt prejudice?
So I can think of I can think of several, but the one that sticks out in this moment is when I first arrived as a student. There weren't many students of color in the entire School of Theater and Dance. there were probably, out of approximately 200 to 300 students, there were probably 8 to 10 Black students, right? Ironically, the vast majority were graduate students. So we didn't necessarily have interaction with the undergraduates. But I remember an experience when I was cast in the show as an ensemble member, and the director, I was the only Black person in the set on the production. And the director wanted to create a moment where my character gets into a physical altercation and gets killed. This is not in the script, right? This was a moment that was completely fabricated by the director to create a transition moment, right? So nowhere in the script did it call for an act of violence, more specifically, an act of aggression on the part of the only Black person in the production. And then my character gets killed and drug off stage. That at the time felt wrong, but as a student you feel powerless. This is your teacher. This is the one who's going to ultimately grade you. You've heard stories, and it got worse. There were classmates who had even more egregious experiences in the classroom, but times have changed. And now I'm part of the faculty to be able to help facilitate new conversations. But yeah, there were times when only the men of color, for one particular professor, she wanted them to be shirtless, and if there was an opportunity for an act of aggressive sexualizing, she wanted it to be seen, right? And it's like, nowhere in the script did it require a shirt to be taken off or a kiss, but that's what sexualizing the body meant, But it was interesting.
Wow. Just out of curiosity, for the play, what's the title of the play and when is it?
Yeah, the title of the play is New Barry. It's going to premiere November 5th, and it's going to run the 5th through November 10th at the Hippodrome Theater downtown. And so the project is happening in collaboration with the Hippodrome Theater, the School of Theater and Dance, partially funded by the Racial Justice Initiative. And the play is actually in conversation with a larger 2-year reconciliation effort that the city of Newberry is doing. So the mayor is involved in the process. We got commissioners and local leaders and pastors and community members who are deeply vested in this work of healing. So the play folds into that larger effort. And for our purposes, the play is being created by the very students who felt subjected and marginalized while they were here. So it's a really powerful piece.
I would love to pass this information along to the grant committee and also to the sort of the steering committee of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, and we'd love to spread the news. So
that would be amazing. So our flyer is just about done. It should be done within the next few days or so. As soon as it's done, I'll get it out with a little blurb about the project, but that'd be great.
Awesome. Yeah, just please send it to me and I'll spread the word.
Sure. Thank you.
So the next question I have for you is, what motivated you to follow your career path? Were there any Black mentors, either in your social circle or in school, or in your professional environment that played a motivational factor for you to follow your career path?
No. I came to teaching really in response to trying to keep a active profile as an artist, right? I had when I was a student at UF, I had one Black faculty member, and when I was upon graduation, I was doing some freelance actor work, all the stuff that goes along with being an acting a professional actor, you take a bunch of side jobs. And one of those side jobs was being an adjunct at a local college in upstate New York. And then that opened up to be a larger, like, part-time position as a visiting faculty member. And this was fresh out of college. And so a part of my scholarship package, both at UF and Syracuse University, was to teach. And even beyond that, teaching has always been a part of my offering as a person. And so I literally, fresh out of college, every single semester I was at somebody's university doing adjunct or part-time teaching. And when I moved to LA, I taught at a conservatory, I taught at a 2-year college, I taught at an acting school. And then when I moved to Atlanta, that was the shortest bout where I wasn't teaching. And when I came back to Gainesville to be closer to my son, teaching at UF actually opened up to be a random opening because the school had a failed search. And so they needed somebody to kind of fill in the gap while they did a national search, you know? So it was when I was on that temporary 8-month contract for UF that I discovered that teaching was an extension of my artistry. And so that was, upon discovering that, I was like, oh my goodness, it's not separate. It's not, oh, I'm teaching on the side while I do my thing as an artist and a filmmaker. It's like, no, to teach is an extension of that art. And so when I made that epiphany, I applied to the position, the full-time assistant professor position, and went through the process and was ultimately hired. So, you know, how I came to this path was definitely, you know, bouncing around. So I discovered this is a part of, dare I say, calling, you know, in what I do as a person.
Was the decision solely based upon being closer to your son to get to become employed at UF, or were there other factors?
So let me tell you the story briefly. It's a long story, but I'll say it briefly. When I was in Atlanta, I was, you know, doing the acting thing, was on some film sets, and I found out that my girlfriend at the time, we had an unplanned pregnancy. And so I moved to Gainesville to be closer to my son. I was back and forth from New York doing some acting projects. And so my son is 2.5 years old now. So I've been in Gainesville for 3 years. So literally just a few months before he was born. When I got to Gainesville, even though I had graduated from the university, I wanted to come back to my alma mater with like awards and like a Netflix series under my belt. I wanted to come back with more than just a few credits. I wanted, I guess it was pride, but I wanted to be able to say that I made it, you know, whatever that means. So I didn't reach out to anybody at the university. And upon being here for a year, not seeing anybody, not telling anybody I was in town, there was a position that opened up in the university to do digital marketing. So I'm a filmmaker as well. So I've made music videos and stuff like that. So I reached out to my old teacher and was like, hey, I'm in town. I'm applying for this position that may or may not work out. Can you be a reference? And that professor was like, oh my goodness, you need to email this other professor. He's an interim school director. Just tell him you're in town as soon as you can. So I was like, all right, I don't know what that means. So I emailed my other professor and was like, hey, I'm in town. You know, he was like, okay, I'm gonna call you right now. So come to find out, they needed somebody to direct a summer play because all the other faculty were going on leave or doing research. So they just needed somebody. I had done directing for, at this point, 12 years. And so I was like, all right, perfect. This is a good fit. So I came in, directed that show. Then the following show, the director that they hired couldn't be in town until halfway through the rehearsal process. So he needed a co-director, and the interim director was like, Ryan, here's another opportunity. Could you co-direct? I was like, all right, cool. Then there was a third play because the interim school director had gotten hired by the Hippodrome to direct the play. And he was like, hey, let's keep this ball rolling. Are you interested in directing a third play? And I was like, let me read it. This looks amazing. Yes. And so he called me again and said, listen, we just found out that our search was a failed search. So we're looking for an adjunct position just to cover these next couple of semesters. And I was like, okay, I don't know what acting projects may or may not come between now and then, but let's move forward. It was opportunity to have 9 months of work while I kind of figured the next step out. And so it was in that temporary contract that I discovered that teaching was a part of my art making. And they were about to do this national search. And I was encouraged by my peers, my colleagues, to say, hey, take a good look at this position. What you're currently teaching is what the position posting is going to be. And so I gave it some thought and I applied, went through the whole process and ultimately got the position. So that's how I came to UF as a permanent faculty member. And so my son was a catalyst for me being in Gainesville. Me applying for the position on a permanent basis was in response to discovering that teaching was a part of my art, right? So I could have been in Gainesville still doing a freelance actor director thing, but it was because I discovered, wow, like teaching is a part of my art making. It's what deepens my art making. So that's how I ultimately decided to make UF where I would apply to. So the way in which I got to be a professor was not a straight shot. Indefinitely, I can be, because this conversation is about faculty recruitment and retention, I can tell you that, let me think, every single opportunity I got to teach, whether it was a part-time faculty member, whether it was a contract that came through the dean's office at Syracuse University, whether I was hired by a university to direct plays or create plays, which is what happened in upstate New York, whether I was teaching at a conservatory in California, or even as far as the temporary adjunct position at UF, George, every single position came from somebody happened to know me, right? That wasn't because I didn't use Indeed or Interfolio or any other traditional format of applying, right? I don't know what that means other than when I was a name on a resume, no matter what my qualifications were, I can tell you with confidence it was because the hiring authority knew my work and what I was bringing to the table that I was given the opportunity. In fact, my understanding, and I don't know if this is the final reason, but my understanding is one of the reasons my current position had a failed search is because it reflected the traditional, white canon. You know what I mean? So unless the hiring bodies are intentional, I'm talking about non-traditional reaching out. How do we go into spaces and say, hey, we're doing a concerted effort to broaden what it means to have Black faculty? Like, a posting on our website is not sufficient, nor is an advertisement in a conference bulletin, for example, even if the conference is geared toward Black faculty. Like, it has to be way more than that. I mean, especially in my experience, the reason why I was offered the positions outside of the permanent position was because I knew they happened to have a hole. They needed, somebody to cover a class, so I don't know what the experience of other Black faculty was, but in my experience, every single time I taught at a university, it was because there was a hole, they needed it to be filled, and they happened to know me, and I was at the right spot at the right time,
Okay. Have you experienced any prejudice, discrimination, or microaggressions while at UF? Can you give us any specific examples?
Let me see. So as a faculty member, and because we are in the space where everybody is clear about and intentional about being anti-racist, I have not experienced it from my peers. But through my journey, I have felt that from students, right? I can think of experiences where I could feel that my white students felt like, I don't know, I can't speak what was in their mind, but it felt like they questioned my credibility to be their instructor, right? So when I was at Syracuse University, for example, I taught a class. It was Intro to African American Literature. It was one of those classes, right? And I remember there were two students who would have their laptop open, and every time I would say something, they would Google it. And I knew they were Googling it because if I had a year off, or if I had some fact that was not quite connected to what they pulled up, they would try to check me on it. That was a journey. And that was me fresh out of UF with my MFA. I have a terminal degree. I have a master's degree in Black Studies. I have a undergraduate degree in African World Studies. I'm qualified to teach what I'm teaching, but my heart would be racing. George, before I would walk in class, I would shut my office door and just take a breath, a cleansing breath, and do some affirmations, because I knew I was walking into a space where it wasn't inviting, And I know they weren't doing that to their white professors. I know it. I don't have to be told otherwise. Because I know the experience of being in a classroom as a student. Somehow when the information comes from somebody of European descent, the expectation is it's just accurate. So you allow the information to wash over you. But if it's somebody, dare I say, a person of color, or maybe they're younger than what you're expecting, or whatever, the pushback was extreme, So the microaggressions have ironically come from the students, but not at UF. And recently I have not had that experience, thankfully, because the spaces that we're currently cultivating are one that invites a diverse body of experiences and perspectives. So yeah.
Okay. Can you speak to the direction the leadership has taken in the College of Arts in relation to racism and anti-racist action?
Yeah, I'm excited because I was actually hired under a meta narrative that spoke to how intentional the college was about bringing in artists who consider themselves catalysts for change, change makers, artists who wanted to revisit and, dare I say, shake up the norms that have been established as the way we do things, right? And so another thing that excited me was there was a very strong pivot on artists as entrepreneurs. That's a different mindset altogether, right? Traditional art spaces are, you teach them technique and they go off and fly away. But to reframe our job as instructors as helping to usher in entrepreneurs who make art, that was a big pivot. That's possible by recognition of oneself, right? That's acknowledging what this artist brings into a space, right? A color consciousness, as opposed to, I'm gonna let my art speak for itself. So the fact that the meta narrative, and there has been intentional discussions about what it means to be a person of color in an anti-racist institution, and even the pillars that make up that meta strategy, because the meta strategy and the meta narrative are two different elements. The meta strategy being the pillars by which the College of the Arts hopes to move forward. Having inclusion as one of the pillars, and it feels like that type of intentionality is exciting and is welcomed. So on a institutional level within the College of the Arts, it feels like, yeah, we're moving in the right direction.
Has there been any pushback that you could speak to against that meta narrative?
Yeah, in fact, as a college, we've gone through a college-wide process of revisiting an element of the meta strategy that specifically called out white men, and it specifically called out privilege. And there was a larger conversation about marginalizing people, non-white, or how do I say, there was a larger conversation about, do we marginalize white people by having this in a meta strategy? And so the vote that came from the entire college was to, pull that particular element off of the website, to then open up space for a larger conversation, to then create something that reflects all bodies that are interested, all bodies that are concerned. So yeah, it has not been a homogenous embracing of it, which I think it's okay because it opens a space for discussion. But I'm hopeful that the discussion leads way to even more provocative change, right? Because what typically happens is if feathers are ruffled, the inclination is to snatch it down, right? But it feels like what's happening now is it's an intentional effort to, go back to the drawing board as a college and have the necessary conversations around why this may feel problematic. Because there are people on all sides who say, don't change a thing. This is a part of our mission. This is what it means to be anti-racist. And then there are other perspectives that say, by calling this thing out, I feel marginalized as a white person, so it's a necessary conversation, brother. So
How did that make you feel when you learned of this pushback? Did you witness it, or did you heard it, or if you heard of it, how did it make you feel?
So the way it worked was we actually had special meetings that were called by the school directors. So the College of the Arts is comprised of schools and centers and an institute, and all of the directors were invited to have special meetings within their schools and programs and centers. And we had a conversation, special meeting within the School of Theater and Dance. And upon learning about it, my initial response was, this is ridiculous. Change nothing. Let's have a conversation about how we protect the most vulnerable population, right? Because the question was, this could go viral. The provost was aware of it. if this thing, like, how are faculty members, the most vulnerable among us, protected if this thing goes awry, right? And the argument was the most vulnerable among us are the students, you know? And within the School of Theater and Dance, the students have demonstrated over and over again that they are deeply committed to change, right? And so how dare we say that we aren't willing to have discomfort? You know, so my immediate reaction was, let's change nothing, and let's produce a statement as to why we're not going to change a thing. So that was my initial feelings. But as a college, the vote came down to the majority wanting to, you know, remove the statement and go back to the drawing board after having larger conversations, and then to create something that felt more inclusive. So part of, you know, my feelings about that are, I don't know enough of the other side to fully reject it. And I'm deeply interested in learning more about the concerns of the other parties. You know what I mean? Like, I know what it feels like to grow up as a person of color and to go to Publix and people assume that I'm an employee because I'm pushing a cart, even though clearly I'm not wearing a Publix uniform. I know what it feels like to walk. It literally just happened the other day. I was walking through Lowe's, and they wear vests with shine, like, you know, this is an employee, and somebody walks up to me and is asking me where something is, and I'm like, but that is the framework by which you see. I don't know, maybe I don't know what I was presenting, what I was, other than the t-shirt and jeans. But the assumption is, oh, clearly he works here. But the assumption isn't clearly he's a medical doctor. You know, it's a society in which we grow. And so I'm interested in learning about the other perspective. It's okay, what does it mean that they feel marginalized? I'm curious for sure, after having experienced that thing often, you know?
I have some comments I can make after the interview is over that I think might be helpful, but I don't want to take time away from our interview. The next question I have is sort of, you know, elaborating upon something you've already discussed. I'm just curious if you had something to add. What should the administration do, from your view, to recruit Black faculty and staff? You kind of already spoke to this, but is there anything else you would like to add?
Yeah, I think, and this might sound obvious, but the culture, the space, the environment in which the current faculty inhabit has to be one of support and validation and all the things. Like, we fail if we create a strategy to bring in Black faculty if the environment is not conducive for their growth, their mental wellness, their success, right? So my first inclination is, how do we identify the challenges that current Black faculty have? How do we adjust, pivot, strategize, improve? So when the idea of retention, like one colleague said, it's easy to get tenure. You just do the work. It's more difficult to stay, right? Because if the environment you don't feel welcome, and we're having the same conversations within the School of Theater and Dance around recruitment. So there are very clear intentional efforts to bring Black students to the program because there's so few of them. But if the culture isn't here to support them, so they don't feel invisible, we're only perpetuating the very struggle which makes it a traditionally white institution, right? So first, I would say, if I could speak to administrators, I would say there would need to be a concentrated effort to identify the challenges that current Black faculty have, to identify strategies to improve retention rates, and by virtue of that success, the ripple effect of that will go further than any email or any advertisement on the Higher Chronicle, whatever those ad spaces are. You know what I mean?
Is there anything specific you want to mention in terms of retention? What strategies do you think administration could specifically adopt that would help retain Black faculty and staff?
I think so. There are, and I can only speak for myself and conversations I've had with faculty across the university. I can say it's easy to feel like you're a part of a machine and to be unclear about, how do I say this? I'm trying to find because I know we're being recorded. I'm trying to find a way to say this and not I'm trying to find to say this as clear as I can. All right. So as a person of color, I'm talking for myself, we are raised, dare I say, conditioned to be present but silent, right? There's a double consciousness that exists. We know when to speak and not speak. We know there's an internal censoring that's happening always, whether it's a small community, a small committee, a working group, a larger meeting. It's because either we've witnessed or have experienced unsafe spaces, right? I don't know how administrators can help the units within themselves become safe spaces. I don't even know if that's their job, right? But I have had conversations with colleagues where they literally turn their Zoom camera off and they're like, I cannot believe people can say this, right? Because if they feel like their peers haven't prioritized anti-racism, or because we live in an intellectually free space, people feel challenged by a desire to retain Black faculty, for example, right? The argument is, how come nobody's trying to retain me? It's like, so it's I don't know. I guess the answer that I can give is spaces for a working group, because I don't have the answer other than having come through a lifetime of knowing when to be quiet. What adjustments do you make? It would definitely have to be bigger than any one person's idea. So that's not a clean answer.
Okay. What is your view on converting lecturer positions into tenure track positions? How can the administration approach such a process?
I think looking at that professor, that lecturer's body of work, and literally neutralizing the what one would frame as academically rigorous or academically sound, right? For example, if a lecturer is deeply involved in community practice, if the lecturer is developing work in response to the needs of community spaces, that's not anything that would nearly equate to a publication for it. You know what I mean? Like, so is there a way to look at that lecturer's body of work and see what does that inventory look like if we set aside what we frame as prestige, right? And say, okay, this person has 30 years of practice in X, Y, and Z. Here's what they've been doing. They have an active presence on a local radio station, doing Sunday morning call and response or whatever the thing is, right? But I would say one quick way to do that is to just assess their work as a lecturer and also put value on their work as an instructor. So most lecturers, they're carrying more than 2 classes a semester. They're carrying sometimes 3, 4, 5 classes. And if they're doing a lab, there has to be value in that, right? Other than being a pure laborer. What does that mean then? And you better believe if they're teaching that many classes, they are innovative in those teaching spaces. So how do we sit down with that lecturer and say, okay, you've been teaching this class. What have you been able to incorporate? What new ways have you been able to teach this module? And assign value to that. That's what I would say. That's one quick way to do it.
What level of mentoring are you expected to provide? You kind of spoke to that. You alluded to support for students. So what level of mentoring are you expected to provide in your capacity right now?
Yeah, so in my capacity, I serve as a mentor for graduate students as they prepare their thesis documents, informal mentoring, as well as serving as faculty mentor at various levels of student projects. But the one that has probably already been mentioned in interviews with other faculty, as a Black faculty member, there's a lot of informal mentoring that we do for students of color, right? And as Black faculty, we make ourselves present and available for Black students because those Black students feel most safe in having conversations. So I can tell you, as recent as a few days ago, a student said, "Hey, can we just do a quick Zoom call? Something happened in class on Tuesday. I just got to get it off my chest." Right? That's not a student I've ever had in the classroom. Right? I've only ever passed her in halls. Right? But she knows that we can have a safe conversation. And what I've done in the past is I set up quick 15, 30-minute introductions with all the students of color in the entire school and just say, I'm here. I want to introduce myself. We may not ever have a class together, but hey, my office is always open. And to have that intentional reach out, that's not a part of my job description, but that's something that I know is deeply important, especially for a student who could feel invisible in a class where they're the only student of color.
Okay. The last 2 questions are more general, like social questions. And the first one is, in your view, what does it mean to be an ally?
A white ally or just ally in general?
Both.
Got it. In my view, now I'll use I'm thinking specifically an anti-racist work. An ally, I immediately think of, a person of European descent, white person who is deeply committed to supporting Black community members, Black faculty, Black spaces, that allyship looks like deep, real learning, right? As opposed to being in a space where you're attempting to offer your expertise or offer your feelings about the issue, but to be in a space where it's intentional learning, right? That's what allyship looks like to me. And I use that model when I'm in spaces where I happen to be the only teacher, right? Or if I happen to be the only person of color, I'm in there to learn. The irony is, if I'm the only person of color, I end up having to be the spokesperson for the entire Black race. You know, that's not necessarily true as a faculty member, but in other spaces where I'm the only person of color. And I mentioned it earlier, you know, to this day, people, when they get an opportunity, they'll ask me about slavery. They'll give me an example when they stood up for the only Black friend that they had in 1971. It's like, okay, you know, for me, that's not allyship. You know, allyship looks like learning. It looks like being in the space to learn. Yeah, it's good to find a way to assist, but allyship is not having a white savior swoop in, right? Allyship is to stand by, to stand ready, right? And in terms of other allyship, in my personal experience, when I'm in spaces, for me, allyship looks like being at the ready, right? To say, I don't know if it's appropriate for me to even be in these meetings, but no, I'm here. And if there comes a project or an endeavor or exercise or a master class or whatever, that my presence could be of assistance, let me know. You know, but it's a very intentional distance that's self-imposed, because I know what it means, you know.
And the last question I have is, what is, in general, what is your view of the Black Lives Matter movement?
In general, I think the Black Lives Matter movement has done an incredible job of putting at the forefront things that Black folk have known for years. I think, as what was true in the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Lives Matter movement is led by the youth, and it should be that way, right? It's not perfect. It's not without its faults or flaws, but it is a necessary response to where we currently find ourselves. Furthermore, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is and should be in conjunction with other efforts, right? So it's not enough that, excuse me one second. Thank you. It's not enough that we rely solely on one group of people or one organization to be the singular response, right? So when I think of like the Civil Rights Movement, I think of the SCLC, I think of SNCC, I think of different organizing bodies that didn't even have names. I think of the grandmoms who decided on Sunday morning they're gonna bake cakes and sell them, you know, to get money so they can all pool their funds to take taxis, right? It's resilience that's not just public facing, right? And it's acknowledging that resilience and resistance is happening at every single stage, you know? So I think in general, it's a necessary movement. I think the challenge is it has been politicized in such a way, and it's been marginalized unrightfully because it was never intended to be the singular response to systemic racism. But it becomes the easy scapegoat to say that this group of people are whining or too militant, or dare I say scary, you know? But yeah, I do think Black Lives Matter. History will show us that there was Black Lives Matter, that there were artists, that there were curators, that there were public intellectuals, that there were pastors, that there were school teachers who had collective action, right? And that's what history tells us about the civil rights movement.
All right, well, I'd like to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me today for this interview. It's all the questions I have. I'm going to go ahead and turn the recorder off at this point. There is a couple more things I need to ask afterwards, so just hang tight. Don't leave the Zoom call.
For sure. Thank you.